Well, I joked last Sunday with some of you as you were leaving that I've been concerned that I might run out of things to say about the fruit of the Spirit. We're on our 6th week of our series, Flesh versus Spirit, and for all but the first week of this series, we've been going through Paul's fruit of the Spirit from Galatians one by one. And just to clarify, if you're not familiar with the fruit of the Spirit, they are qualities listed by the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians that are nurtured in us by God's Holy Spirit. The Spirit does this as we learn to listen to Him as He speaks to us through our conscience. Now, what I've been trying to do is clarify how we can recognize these fruit within ourselves and how to keep our human fleshly impulses from stifling those fruits. Our instincts, emotions, and intellect are God-given capacities. They're not inherently evil, as we might conclude, but without the Spirit's guidance, they lead us into destructive behaviors and attitudes. Now, I have to admit something. It was not my idea to do a series on the fruit of the Spirit. So those of you who have really enjoyed this series, I've got to make a confession. It wasn't my idea. It was my wife's idea. It was my wife's idea to walk through the fruit one by one. I was resistant to the idea because I couldn't imagine having an entire sermon's worth to say about each of the fruit of the Spirit. But if there's anything that the last 5 years in ministry have taught me, is that I need to listen to my wife's advice. And so far, I've been pleasantly surprised how much I've been able to discover searching the Scriptures for what else God might teach us about each of these fruit of the Spirit. But when I got to kindness and goodness, I really started to sweat. Friends, I don't know if you realize it, but sermon prep is not an easy thing. Allow me to explain how difficult preparing for this particular sermon was. First of all, how is kindness different from love, the very first fruit of the Spirit that I talked about? And goodness sure sounded like a vague term. Think about it, goodness. The English word itself is a little bit vague, don't you think? So I did the first thing I always do when I'm stuck. I go to the original language. Believe it or not, the New Testament was not written in English, as some might believe. The first English authorized translation of the Bible, commonly known as the King James Version, was translated. Anybody have a guess of what year? 1611. Only about 400 years ago. New Testament's 2,000 years ago. King James Version is only 400 years. So, no, the New Testament was not written in English. It was originally written in Greek. And as is the case with any translation, sometimes the nuance gets lost. So it's part of preparing for a sermon to turn back to the original language to hopefully get some of that nuance back. Now, the first resource that I consulted said that the word for kindness meant this: moral goodness, integrity, benignity, kindness. And then when I looked up goodness, that same resource called it uprightness of heart, goodness, kindness. Do you see why that wasn't particularly helpful? Yeah. So I consulted a different resource. It was a massive volume that's used by serious Greek scholars. That resource said that the word for kindness meant uprightness in one's relations with others, the quality of being helpful or beneficial, goodness, kindness, generosity. Aha! I thought I'd found it. There's something a little bit different here. Maybe kindness is helpfulness and generosity. That's what stands out about kindness. And then I looked up the word for goodness. Positive moral quality characterized especially by interest in the welfare of others, goodness, generosity. You see why sermon prep isn't easy? Well, that's when I came to the conclusion that kindness and goodness are the same thing. You with me so far on that? They're the same thing. So then why does Paul list both? Why is he being redundant? Couldn't he have just used one or the other if they mean the same thing? Well, Repetition in the Bible usually means that the author wants to emphasize the idea he's communicating. Paul is telling us that this idea of helpfulness, of generosity, of active displays of concern for the welfare of others is a big deal. This is the fruit of the Spirit that Paul points to with the words kindness and goodness, an active concern for the welfare of others, a spirit of helpfulness and generosity. Now, even before Jesus began his ministry, his cousin John the Baptist was preaching about kindness and goodness in his own way. In Luke's gospel, John says to the crowds, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." John was a quite fiery preacher, if you didn't get that impression already. "What should we do then?" the crowds asked. John answered, "Anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none, and anyone who has food should do the same." This is John's picture of kindness and goodness. When you have more than you need, share with the one who doesn't have. Pretty straightforward principle, right? Let me repeat that because we can't afford to miss this basic principle of kindness and goodness. When you have more than you need, share with the one who doesn't have. But what about Jesus? Does Jesus have anything to say about kindness and goodness specifically? Well, I'm sure that you will believe he does. A lot. But there's one concise statement of his from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew I'd like to share with you. He says, "Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." I don't imagine it's a hard sell to convince you that the Bible teaches us to be kind and good to each other. But what's hard is overcoming our fleshly inclinations that keep us from being kind and good to each other. So what is it that keeps us from being kind? What keeps us from helping each other or being generous to each other? Well, here's the thing. Kindness, helpfulness, and generosity imply giving of our resources. Now, those resources can be time, they can be energy, they can be material wealth. And I hope I don't have to tell you that none of us have an infinite supply of any of those things. None of us have an infinite supply of time. None of us have an infinite supply of energy. None of us have an infinite supply of material wealth. And if you do, I'd like to talk to you about planned giving. I got a few chuckles from that. None of us have an infinite supply of those resources. Now, sometimes we legitimately don't have enough as we want. We don't have enough of those resources to be as helpful or generous as we'd like to be. Sometimes it happens. We have to prioritize how we use those resources. And our first responsibility is taking care of ourselves so nobody else has to, and those who depend on us, primarily our families. Sometimes we go through seasons where we have little or no extra in any of those categories, but that usually should only happen for seasons, periods of a few months or a few years. It shouldn't be a permanent state, because if it's a permanent state, something's probably out of balance. Most of the time, if we're honest with ourselves, we have more of a surplus in at least one of those categories than we think we do. Time, energy, material wealth. And if we don't, we need to pause and reevaluate our priorities. Something is out of balance if we don't have some sort of extra or surplus in one of those categories. In the words of Jesus, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where you invest your time, energy, and material wealth is a reflection of your priorities. It's a reflection of what's important to you. Now, just to reemphasize, you do have to take care of your own physical, mental, and emotional needs. That is not being selfish. You can't pour out of an empty cup, and you can't give when you don't have in the first place. You also have a responsibility to those who depend on you, your family, and to a lesser extent, those whom you work with and for. And your church depends on you. But how often do we waste our resources on pursuits that aren't worthwhile or life-giving? If you find yourself with no surplus in any of these categories, nothing that you can give away or share in terms of time, energy, or material wealth, ask yourself, is there any waste of time, energy, or material wealth in my life that could be better invested through kindness and generosity? Is my life somehow out of balance? Sometimes we just hold on too tightly to what we have. We don't want to give it up. It's mine, we think. We have a sense of entitlement about it. There was a wealthy young man who posed a question to Jesus. He said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus simply pointed him to a few of the commands of God from the Old Testament, and the man replied, "Teacher, all these I've kept since I was a boy." To which Jesus replied, "One thing you lack. Go, sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." And if you're familiar with this story, you know what came next. At this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. This was a man too attached to what he had. You know, I try not to get on a personal soapbox up here. I believe that doing so disrespects the sanctity of the pulpit, so that is not my intent in what I'm about to say. I am speaking out of personal conviction, not as a rant. But when I think about corporate executives taking enormous bonuses while laying off employees, I get steamed. When I think about celebrities buying $2 million diamond-studded dog collars, it makes me sick. When I think about billionaires attending fancy black-tie fundraisers and think they're doing something noble, it infuriates me. Too many people in this country, too many people in this world are suffering under the weight of poverty for a select few to be enjoying such outlandish luxury. Those are people who have way too much extra, and they are not sharing it. Shame on anyone who claims to follow Christ and yet lives that way. But there are other obstacles to kindness and goodness besides selfishness, greed, or materialism. Sometimes we know we have the extra, but we fear being taken advantage of. We worry that cash we give to the man holding the sign at the stoplight won't actually use it for food. We worry that one act of kindness won't be enough. We worry that the needy person may keep coming back, consuming all of our extra and beyond. And yeah, that's a risk. Yeah, that's a danger. But need I repeat the words of Jesus I spoke on last week about judging others? We can never know a person's true intentions, and when it comes down to it, it really doesn't matter. True, when we have limited resources, we want to make sure it's providing the greatest and most long-term benefit it can. That's just wisdom. That's just prudence. But there are better ways to prevent abuse than simply not providing kindness at all. If you're worried that the money you give away will be used for drugs or alcohol or cigarettes instead of food, well, consider giving the needy person a restaurant gift card. Better yet, if you've got the time available, take him to McDonald's yourself and get to know his story. See if you can point him to resources that might make a more permanent difference in his life. After all, if we're able, we should choose to provide help that will help the person more long-term rather than just providing Band-Aid assistance that fosters independence. Whatever we choose to do to provide kindness and goodness, let me make it plain that fear of potential abuse is no excuse for altogether withholding kindness of some kind. Other times we might question whether or not someone deserves our kindness. Maybe it's because we conclude that the person's hardship is his or her own fault. That might look like withholding treatment from someone who contracts a disease from sharing needles, or refusing an unwed mother material assistance because she got pregnant out of wedlock. Whatever our reasons might be for thinking someone doesn't deserve our kindness, we are wrong. There are no two ways about it. We are called to love all people, to imitate our God who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The person's situation may or may not be his or her own doing. Our task remains the same. Consider the story Jesus told, commonly called the parable of the prodigal son. The word prodigal means wasteful. This is a story about a son who demanded his inheritance from his father, only to squander it on what Jesus calls wild living. He came to regret his choices and returned to beg that his father allow him back into the home as a servant. But the father was so overjoyed to be reunited with his son that instead of taking him in as a servant, he threw a party to celebrate the son's return. Then the prodigal son's older brother, who had stayed and worked his father's land all these years, was indignant. Here he had worked all of these years, stayed faithful to his father, and his father was having a party for this wasteful, disrespectful, deadbeat little brother? Well, the father came out and begged the older brother to join the party. He said, "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The older brother was so focused on what he thought his little brother deserved that he was missing the beauty of kindness, compassion, and redemption playing out in front of him. We do the same thing when we deny someone kindness because we, in our flawed estimation, think he or she doesn't deserve it. We're only scratching the surface about what the Bible has to say about generosity. If I had more time, I might share with you the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. This was a story about two men who died, one wealthy and one poor. In the afterlife, the wealthy man who had never shared his wealth with anyone suffered, while the poor man who had suffered all his life was in a refreshing place of comfort. You know, it occurs to me, I don't preach a lot on hell. I just don't. It's not that I don't believe in hell. I most certainly do. I just prefer to talk about the beauty of what God offers us. I think that it's more important to emphasize the beauty of what God wants to invite us into. But do you notice that in so many of these scriptures there's strong language about judgment here? That should tell us what a big deal to God generosity, kindness, goodness are to God. And they're not meant to be burdens. Let me make that clear. None of these fruit of the Spirit that I've been sharing with you are meant to be burdensome. They are things that the Spirit is already planting inside of us. We just have to get out of the way. That's the whole point of this series. The whole point of this series is not try harder. The point is listen more to what God is doing in your heart and get yourself out of the way. That is the key to living the Christian life. It's not try harder. It's let God do it and simply get out of the way. This isn't supposed to be a burden, but it is something to be taken seriously. That's why there's so much language of judgment connected with language of kindness and compassion and goodness, because it's that big of a deal to God. There's one more teaching of Jesus relevant to this subject that I can't help but share with you. You might be familiar with it. It's from Matthew chapter 25. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you?" By the way, side note, the word for stranger is also the word for foreigner. "When did we see you sick and in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, a foreigner, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They will also answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for the one of the least of these, you did not do for me." We are all blessed with just a little extra time, energy, and or material wealth than we need. If not, something in our life is out of balance. May you find that balance so that you may be a blessing of kindness and goodness in whatever way God enables you.